Please welcome Mike to come and speak to us.
Thanks, brother. Here we go.
Impact and safety, and few people play safety better than the Ravens' Ed Reed.
I remember that play. I just saw the guy coming back. I was like, oh, this is it. This is that one hit. I'm sorry for him right now. Oh, no! Yes!
I am so glad I don't do that for a living. Woo! I have a friend, Mike DeVito. He played 9 years in the NFL, and he's had multiple surgeries on his shoulder, and he just says that he's in constant pain even today from that. And I mean, he's just in his mid-30s. And his wife told him a few years ago, you need to get out. You need to get out. We want you around for a while. They watched that movie Concussion, and they said, you got to get out of the NFL. So he did. Now, he didn't do too poorly. I mean, he played 9 years, made $9 million. I mean, so he made more in 1 year than I'll probably make in a lifetime, you know. So, that's a rough sport. And, of course, you want to have some really good protection. So they wear shoulder pads, a cup, you know, knee pads, and all kinds of pads. But, of course, the most important piece of equipment a football player wears is the helmet. If you're not wearing your shoulder pads, you're going to get messed up, maybe paralyzed. But if you're not wearing a helmet, it could cost you your life. So you don't want to try to go cheap and save money when it comes to the helmet. You want the very best thing out there. So you know, I'm from Baltimore, so I'm a Baltimore Ravens fan. And, you know, if I'd been raised and lived in Dallas, I'd be a Cowboys fan. If I lived in Dallas and liked high school sports. So anyway, you don't want to cut corners on something as important as the helmet because of all the head blows. It's really important. You know, it's interesting, at least in the U.S., what we'll do is we will send our kids off to university, a secular university, where they get all kinds of head blows. They get in class, and I've been to so many college campuses where a student will say, just like in the movie God is Dead, or God is Not Dead, that the professor will say on the first day of class, how many of you are Christians? And when some raise their hand, he'll say, my objective is by the end of this semester, you will no longer be a Christian. And it's like, wow. And it's happening all over, even in the Bible Belt of the U.S., it's happening. And what's interesting, the professors, none of them will say, how many of you are Muslims? How many of you are Hindus? Can you imagine a Christian professor saying, how many of you are atheists? You know, they'd get booted from their school. Somehow they'd work around and get booted even if they had tenure. But you can do it. It's all out season on Christians. It's a spiritual battle. So they get all these head blows, and they don't have any head protection. And so multiple reports have showed that about 59% of those raised in the church that go off to university will walk away from the church and rethink whether they want to be a Christian. And it's because of all the head blows. And it's the same kind of head blows that come, the same kind of objections. And it's like, well, you just have to prepare for those. It's like if you're going to be at a boxing match, you're going to fight someone, well, you watch all the videos of their previous fights, so you know their strategies, you know what they like to throw, what kind of punches, what kind of combinations, and you practice to become prepared for that. Back in the 1980s and 1990s, I was really keen on inviting Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons in my house and talking to them when they came to my door, because I knew they were going to come to my door. I don't know, do you have them up here? Do they come to your doors? So I knew they were going to come, so it's like, all right, well, let's learn what they're saying. And you learn all their arguments. They give the same arguments all the time. And so you just learn those and learn how to address them, and it's like, cool. I know how to answer them now. I know exactly what they're going to say, and I know how to respond to them. It's the same thing when it comes to all the head blows that come in university or wherever on Christianity. And so it's just learning what's coming. So when it comes to the Gospels, we talked about them last night. There are 5 major objections that skeptics raise about the reliability of the Gospels. 5. And so we're going to discuss these this morning. And we'll call them the ABCs, Ds, and Es of defending the Gospels. Now, last night, I gave you 6 reasons for thinking the Gospels are historically reliable. This morning, we're going to talk about the 5 most common objections to the historical reliability of the Gospels. So let's start with the A's. Authorship. You'll commonly hear it said, this is a favorite of Bart Ehrman's, to say that we have no idea who wrote the Gospels because the Gospels were anonymous. What does he mean by that? In our New Testaments, when you turn to the first page of each of the Gospels, it will identify the author. The Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Luke, Gospel according to John. And what Ehrman and others will point out is that the earliest manuscripts we have that have the first page of the Gospel, none of them will have the titles. So they are formally anonymous. They don't identify the author. And nowhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John does it say who the author is. So, again, the Gospels, technically speaking, are formally anonymous. You say, well, if they're anonymous, we really don't have any idea who wrote them. And if we don't know who wrote them, how do we know we can trust them? That seems to be a reasonable objection on the surface until you start learning about ancient biography. And then you find that of all the ancient biographies out there, and there were somewhere around 90 that were written, if you take a count of all the biographies that have survived that were written about anyone from 150 years before Christ to 150 years after Christ, so that's about 300 years. What biographies of anyone written in that period have survived? There's about 90 of them. And 48 of them, approximately half, were written by a guy named Plutarch. We mentioned him last night. And a lot of what we know about the ancient world comes from Plutarch. Well, so he wrote more than 60, of which these 48 have survived. Guess what? Guess how many times Plutarch's name appears in those 48 lives? Guess how many times there is a title that says, The Life of Caesar according to Plutarch? 0. 0. Guess how many of the approximately 90 biographies from that period that have survived, guess how many of them include the author's name in the title? 0. Guess how many of them had the author's name in the proem, the preface? 1. The Passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata, written in the middle of the 2nd century. That's it. That's it. Now you say, all right, Mike, well, maybe it's convenient. You're conveniently just doing that 150 years on each side of Jesus. What if we went 160 years? Would that change things? Well, guess when the next biography that we have that would have the author's name somewhere in the document? You would have to go all the way to the life of Aelius in the Historia Augusta, written in the final decade of the 4th century. And the Historia Augusta, and the life of Aelius, is regarded as totally worthless for its historical value. It's totally untrustworthy, is what classicists will say. So the bottom line is, it is standard practice for an ancient biography to be anonymous. Virtually all of them are anonymous, and yet we know who wrote them. And it's not just biographies, it's also histories. So you got Julius Caesar and his commentary on the Civil War. Doesn't say who wrote it, it's entirely anonymous. Sallust, one of the greatest Roman historians. Livy, another one of the greatest Roman historians. Both of them, all of their writings are anonymous. Their names don't appear anywhere in them. And yet, historians today have no question who wrote these. Like I talked about Plutarch's Lives. His name doesn't appear anywhere in there. Now, I mentioned Plutarch is regarded as the greatest ancient biographer. He wrote somewhere around the year 90 to just after the year 120. Now, if all of his biographies are anonymous, why do we believe that Plutarch wrote these? Well, that's a really good question, George. Let me address that. Our best evidence is what's called the Lamprius Catalog. The Lamprius Catalog lists all of, it's a catalog in antiquity that lists everything that is attributed to Plutarch. Unfortunately, it's written more than 200 years after Plutarch wrote, and it's falsely attributed to his son, and classicists say there's a lot of literature in that catalog that they're pretty confident Plutarch didn't write. And yet, that is our best evidence for the authorship of Plutarch's Lives. And classicists don't question whether Plutarch wrote those. There's no competing accounts of someone else who wrote them. No one says that, a guy named Joseph wrote those lives. Everybody said Plutarch wrote them. So there's no competing accounts, but even our earliest and best source attributed to Plutarch is severely flawed. When it comes to the Gospels, this just gives you an idea of some of the sources that talked about the authorship. So our very first source is Papias, writing between the years 100 and 130. He mentions the authorship of Matthew, Mark. You got Marcion around the year 145. He mentions the authorship of Luke. You got Justin around the year 150. He mentions the authorship of Mark and Luke. You got all these others. And then even afterward, you have. But the point here is that within 200 years of the death of Jesus, less than 200 years after the death of Jesus, and even a shorter period of time between when the Gospels were written and when they're being attributed to these authors, all of these are in a shorter period of time than when our first source is for Plutarch. So are these perfect sources? No. They're not perfect. Is the authorship of the Gospels, for the traditional authorship, is it unimpeachable? Nope. It's got some problems with the early church fathers, just like Plutarch with the Lamprius Catalog, although the authorship of the Gospels is far better attested than what we have for Plutarch's Lives. Far better, the sources we have for it. Yet you've got a lot of scholars who are questioning the authorship of the Gospels, but no one questions Plutarch's Lives. B, bias. It's commonly said that we can't trust the Gospels because their authors were Christians, and so therefore they were biased. In fact, we read John's Gospel, and it says, I am writing these things in order that you may believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And so it's like John is writing with the agenda of converting people. And so they're not only biased, but it's propaganda, you could say. So should we believe it in such a case? Well, bias doesn't mean you're wrong. So here's the Super Bowl with the Ravens and the 49ers from a few years ago. And I thought our team was going to get crushed. The 49ers definitely had a better team that year. They just seemed unstoppable. And the Super Bowl started in the first half. The Ravens just dominated, and they were running away with it, and they were shocking everyone, even Ravens fans. Halftime came, and then the second half opened, and Baltimore receives the kickoff, and the guy, our player, runs it back for a touchdown and says, oh, man, this is just fantastic. And then something happened. The lights went out in the stadium. No electricity. It's like, Super Bowl, lights go out. What's all this about? And they're out for a while. Finally, the electricity gets restored, and the momentum of the game changes. and it completely goes in San Francisco's favor. And they're coming back, and they're about ready to catch up, and they're within striking. All they have to do, and there's less than a minute in the game, there's only seconds left. It's 4th down. 49ers are like on the 20, 25-yard line of Baltimore, and they got one play left, and if they get a touchdown, they win. And so their player's going out for the pass, and the ball goes just over the guy's fingertips, and Baltimore wins. Yes. There was some contact between the players in the end zone. And so the coach for the 49ers is like jumping around and saying, "Ref, that was interference. You got to call that." And we get one more chance at it, and we get 15 yards, And it's like, was it interference? I mean, there could have been an interference call. It was a judgment call. The ref didn't call it. But it's like, was it interference? Well, it depends whether you were pulling for the Niners or the Ravens, right? If you're a Niners fan, it's like, that's obviously interference. If you're a Baltimore fan, you're thinking, it's football, let them play, right? That's a sport. And we allow our biases to influence how we think about plays and all that, and whether the ref or the umpire was biased. And that's just the way it is with a sport. If that's the way it is with a sport, which very honestly is kind of meaningless, right? Ultimately, when it comes to its value and contributing to life, it's entertainment and that's it. But we get upset over that. We get upset over whether our team wins or loses. If it's that way with sports, how much more so with our worldview, right? Derek Ludeman is he died a couple of years ago. He was an atheist New Testament scholar. He wrote a book in the 1990s about the resurrection of Jesus, and he attempted to refute it. He ended up giving up his Christian faith, and in 2004, he came out with a revised version, a book called The Resurrection of Christ. And in that, he's referring back to his book from the 1990s. Both books tried to refute the resurrection. And here's what he says about the former book. He says, its aim was to prove the non-historicity of the resurrection of Jesus and simultaneously to encourage Christians to change their faith accordingly. Was Ludeman biased? Was he trying to persuade? Isn't that same thing as the Gospel of John? I am writing these things so that you may not believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. But are atheists going around saying, well, we can't believe it then because it's propaganda? No. Should we discount Ludeman's arguments because he's biased and has an agenda? No. We reject them because his arguments suck. Richard Dawkins, a militant atheist who retired from Oxford, he's a scientist, a biologist, he writes his book called The God Delusion. And he says, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who open it will be atheists when they put it down. Is Dawkins biased? Does he have an agenda? It's propaganda, right? Does that mean his book's wrong? No, it's wrong because his arguments stink. In fact, his arguments are so poor in that book that an atheist philosopher of science named Michael Roos, who teaches at Florida State University, said after reading Dawkins' book, it made him embarrassed to be an atheist. C's. We're talking about the ABCs, D's, and E's. C's, contradictions. This is something I've spent a whole lot of time with over the years, more than a decade with this. We're going to be talking about that at Church of the Messiah on Sunday morning. I'm just going to give you a little bit here, but this is the number one objection against the reliability of the Gospels. In fact, Gary Habermas, my mentor, he's like the number one expert in the world on the resurrection of Jesus. And he said that over time, if you not just the present day, but over the centuries, if you look at the number one objection against the resurrection of Jesus, contradictions in the Gospels. So what are we to say about this? You'll have Bart Ehrman, and he's got a little shtick that he does in his lectures, and he'll say something like, that the Gospels contain, they have more on which they disagree than on which they agree, which is false. But then he goes on to say, well, let's just take, for example, what that we have in the crucifixion and resurrection narratives. Was Jesus crucified at 9 a.m., as Mark says, or just afternoon, as John says? It depends which gospel you read. Was he crucified after the Passover meal, like the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke say, or was he crucified before the Passover meal, as John says? Well, it depends which gospel you read. Did Jesus carry his cross all the way, or did Simon of Cyrene help him? It depends which gospel you read. Well, he was crucified between two thieves. Did both thieves curse him, as Mark says, or did one thief repent, as Luke says? It depends which gospel you read. Did the temple veil split and tear in two before Jesus died, as Luke says, or was it afterward, as Matthew and Mark say? It depends which gospel you read. And then you come to the resurrection narratives. When Jesus rose from the dead, how many women went to the tomb? Was it just Mary Magdalene, as John says, or were there multiple women, as the other gospel? It depends which gospel you read. And when they got there, how many angels were at the tomb? Was it one, like Matthew and Mark say, or were there two, like Luke and John? It depends which gospel you read. And then when they came back and told the male disciples, how many went to the tomb? Was it Peter and the beloved disciple, like John says, or was it just Peter, like Luke says? Well, it depends which gospel you read. And where did Jesus first appear to his male disciples? Was it Jerusalem, like Luke and John have, or was it Galilee, like Matthew says and Mark implies? Depends which gospel you read. And by the time that Ehrman gets through all these kind of differences, every Christian in the audience is saying, say it ain't so. Well, it is so. There are these surface discrepancies in the Gospels. So what are we to do about these? What are we to think about these? Well, let me give you just a few answers. Number one, I'm going to give you three answers here. We got to keep the matter in perspective, okay? Now, a little over 100 years ago, there was a ship named the Titanic. It was regarded as unsinkable, and on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic, it was going too fast, it hit an iceberg, and the unthinkable happened. It sank, and more than half of its passengers perished. Now, when we looked, during investigations by both the British and American governments, they asked survivors about what happened, and the responses of some were, well, the Titanic broke in half and then it sank. And then other survivors said, no, the Titanic went down in one piece, and these guys are wrong, and these said, no, they're wrong, the Titanic broke in half. Now, honestly, I don't know how you get that wrong. I mean, it's the most terrifying night of your life. According to reports, it was clear weather, there was no moon, the only light that was coming was from the stars, and this ship that was a little over 700 feet long, all lit up with screams coming from it. And so you're in a lifeboat looking at this ship. You can't miss it. It's the only thing out there. And some said it broke in half and then sank, and others said, no, it went down in one piece. How do you get that wrong? I don't know, but no one turned around and said, well, I guess the Titanic didn't sink. Well, I don't think we can trust anything these people say. No, they just said, it was a tough thing. Some of them got mixed up on their details, and they just misremembered thing on a relatively small detail. But the Titanic sank, all these people died in the process. They knew the major details. It was the peripheral details that some got it wrong. It's not that they all got it wrong. Some got it right, but some got it wrong. So the bottom line is, just because at worst case scenario, let's say we could not explain and give good explanations for some of these surface discrepancies in the Gospels. Let's just say there were some errors or contradictions. Worst case scenarios, we just say some got some peripheral details wrong. But they all said Jesus died by crucifixion. They all said he rose from the dead. They all said that women followers found it empty. They discovered an empty tomb. They all said that there were at least an angel, who announced that Jesus had been raised from the dead. and they all said that Jesus was going to appear to them. And all but Mark narrated such an appearance. So, I mean, it's major stuff that they all agree on. None of them said, well, Jesus survived his crucifixion, or Jesus' body was still in the tomb. That would be problematic. But these little minor discrepancies in the surface details don't change the essence of the story. Number two, we have to be able to determine whether we are looking at a contradiction or a difference. Is it a contradiction or it's a difference? Now, when we're talking about the Titanic, some said it broke in half and sank. Others said, no, it went down intact. That is a contradiction that cannot be reconciled, okay? Let's look at a difference. Let's say that I get home tomorrow night, and my wife is really excited, and she says, Mike, you're not going to believe what happened here, but about an hour ago, the doorbell rang, and I went to the door, and there was this guy at the door, and he had this check, and he said, congratulations, Mrs. Licona, you won the Publishers Clearinghouse. And she said, I don't remember playing that. And, well, you won it, and you won $10 million. Congratulations. And so she's really excited about that. I'm excited about that now. And then a couple minutes after that, she's talking to her brother on the phone, and she says, you're not going to believe what happened a little over an hour ago. The doorbell rang, and there were two guys at the door, and one was holding a check, and the other was video recording it. Said, congratulations, you've won the Publishers Clearinghouse $10 million. She gets off the phone. I'd say, well, you just contradicted yourself, because you said there was just one guy at the door, whereas you told your brother there were two. And so I can't even believe anything you said here. She would say, I didn't say there was just one guy at the door. I only mentioned one guy at the door, the important guy who was holding the check. That is a difference. It's not a contradiction. Most of the surface discrepancies we find in the Gospels are differences. They are not contradictions. So, for example, how many women went to the tomb? Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 1 says, early in the morning, while it was still dark, Peter Mary Magdalene got up and went to the tomb and found it empty. And then she ran back and told Peter, the beloved disciple. They said, but the other Gospels have multiple women. John only mentions Mary Magdalene, but she comes back, finds Peter and the beloved disciple, and says, they have taken the Lord, and we don't know where they've laid him. Who's we? I don't think she's referring to her, Peter, and the beloved disciple, because, I mean, that would be obvious. They didn't even know the tomb was empty. Seems like they're talking about, she's mentioning other women there. You say, okay, possible. But then what happens? Well, you've got in the Gospel of John, you got Peter and the beloved disciple run to the tomb and find it as Mary had said. But in Luke's Gospel, it says Peter ran to the tomb and found it as the women had said. All right, what's going on here? Is it just Peter, or is it Peter and the beloved disciple? Well, in Luke, it doesn't say just Peter. It only mentions Peter. And in fact, 12 verses later, in chapter 24, verse 24, you've got Jesus, and he meets up with the Emmaus disciples. But Luke says their eyes were kept from recognizing him. So he's playing with them a little bit. And as they're walking along, Jesus says, well, why the long faces, guys? Are you the only guy here in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened over the last couple of days? And Jesus says, what? I mean, it must have been fun. No, tell me. Well, Jesus, there's this guy named Jesus. We thought he was a prophet. We thought he's the Messiah. But our leading people, the Jews, our leaders, they crucified him on Friday. But this morning, our women folk went to the tomb, and they said they saw angels who had said he'd been raised from the dead. And then some of our own, multiple people, went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Well, wait a minute, Luke. Just 12 verses earlier, you just said just Peter. Luke would say, I didn't say just Peter. I only mentioned Peter. He's the lead apostle. He's the one on which I'm focusing. And so I only mentioned Peter, but obviously I knew there were others because 12 verses later it said some of our own. But Luke, we don't do that today in the 21st century. Well, what do you think, guys? You think that Matthew and I and Mark and John, do you think we all got together and formed a committee for the misleading of future historians? No, we wrote according to the literary conventions in play at the time of writing. Well, wait a minute. Why does Matthew and Mark have one angel and Luke and John have two? Maybe it's the same thing. They are talking about the angel who is announcing, they're only narrating the angel who's announcing that Jesus rose from the dead, and that's why the empty tomb. It's like shining a literary spotlight on someone. So we've all been to a theatrical performance where you're up on stage, you're watching, there are actors up on stage, and all of a sudden the lights go out and a spotlight shines on a particular actor. You know there are others there, but you only see the one because that's where the spotlight is shining. Well, it's like that in writing ancient biography. It's very common throughout Plutarch's lives and other histories where the author shines a literary spotlight on a certain character. They know that there are others there, but they're only talking about the one who's the most important one in that scene. And that's what's going on in the Gospels. This is a difference, it's not a contradiction. And number 3, we have to look at the Gospels as ancient biographies. We discussed this last night. Gospels are not modern biographies, they're ancient biographies. And ancient biographers had some little different rules for writing than what we do in modern biography. Just because the word biography is there doesn't mean it's exactly the same genre under the same rules. Okay? So the best way I know how to describe it is for those of us who are married, we all recognize that there is the guy version of the story and the girl version, right? Now, of course, I'm stereotyping here, and there are differences. I know guys that do like the girl version of the story and vice versa. But typically speaking, women like details, lots of details. They want to know what happened, where it happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were doing, what they were saying, what they were thinking, what they were wearing, and how they were feeling. Guys are different. We like bullet points. Get to the bottom line. The game's coming on in 5 minutes. We don't care about insignificant details that really don't make a difference in what is being said. How many of you guys, I guess we all have, we've been on the phone, if we're married, we've been on the phone, we're talking to a friend, we're telling them a story about an event that happened that day that we know they'd be interested in hearing, and our wives are in the background and they're saying, you know it didn't happen that way. You forgot to mention this, and it didn't happen like this, and the guy said this. And we're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not trying to deceive this guy. I just know that I've got to bend the details a little bit, because if I don't, I've got to give a 10-minute background story of what happened, and he doesn't care about this. It's like guys just care about the relevant facts. Women care about everything. And so these are just different ways of telling the story. I'm not saying the guy version is a better way. I'm not saying the girl version is a better way. I'm just saying these are different ways of telling the story. Well, ancient biographers told the stories differently as well. If you want to read the girl version of the Gospels, then read Mark. If you want to read the guy version, read Matthew. Okay, maybe let's see. Yeah, I guess I'll save some examples. Well, I'll give you one example, okay? So let's talk about the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple. Now, Mark gives us the girl version. So in Mark, Jesus, it's Palm Sunday, he comes riding on the donkey, comes into Jerusalem, and on Sunday, Palm Sunday, and he and his disciples go into the temple, and they just look around. That's all they do. They look around, and then, because it's late in the day, and then they leave, and they go back to Bethany, and they spend the night in Bethany. Monday morning, they get up, they're returning to Jerusalem. It's morning. Jesus is hungry. They come to a fig tree. There's no figs on it, so Jesus curses it. And then they go into Jerusalem. They go into the temple complex area. And Jesus sees some things going on in the temple of which he doesn't approve. So he cleanses the temple. He overturns the tables, and he drives out the merchants and money changers. That's Monday morning. Then they leave that day. They go back to Bethany, and they spend the night in Bethany. Tuesday morning, they get up. They're returning to Jerusalem again. They come across the fig tree, and Peter looks at it and says, Lord, the fig tree you cursed yesterday has withered and died. That's Mark's version. He gives us the girl version. Matthew gives us the guy version. Sunday, they go up into Jerusalem. They go into the temple. Jesus sees things he doesn't like. He overturns the tables and drives out the money changers. He conflates the Sunday visit with the Monday visit. He conflates the two and simplifies it and just has Jesus, rather than just looking around, he conflates the two and he does the temple cleansing on Palm Sunday. They go back to Bethany that night. The next morning, they get up Monday. They're going into Jerusalem. Jesus sees the fig tree, no figs. He curses it. It withers and dies on the spot. That's it. That's Matthew, the guy version. Now, I can just see it now. Mark's talking to Matthew, and he says, Matty, you know it didn't happen that way. You know, you had it where it was just, they really just went in and visited Sunday, and they didn't cleanse it until Monday. But you conflated the two, and it didn't happen like that. And then, Matt, look what you did with the fig tree. I mean, he cursed it one day, they didn't see it, and it was dried until Tuesday. But you said he cursed it, and it dried up right before their very eyes. Matt, you just lied. And Matthew's just looking at Mark, said, Mark, back off. You remind me of my wife. This is just the way they wrote in antiquity. It's not the wrong way, but we can be glad that Matthew at times simplified the accounts. Why? He did that. He saves room, and now he can write up more stories in the Gospels that Mark may not have had the room to do it. All right? So it's just a different way of writing. Matthew still conveys the essence of what happened. He gives us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. It may not be precise in terms of accuracy, but it gives us the essence. Okay? So it's kind of like I've got a watch that my parents gave me for Christmas back in 1979. It's a Seiko. It loses about, 30 seconds a week. All right? It's not too bad for a watch that old, 40 some years. All right? So it's accurate enough. It's accurate enough if, say, I wanted to have lunch with George and we had to meet at a certain place, that it's going to be accurate enough to get me there. It's going to be accurate enough to get me if I need to be at the airport at a certain time. It'd be accurate enough for that. Now, if I were working for NASA and I had to push the button to launch the rocket at the right moment, it's not accurate enough, right? We're talking about, for biography here, you can have these kinds of literary moves, and it's true enough. It's true enough. Dating. The dating of the Gospels. Now, you'll have some skeptics say, well, the Gospels, most scholars believe, were written between 35 to 65 years after the death of Jesus, the events they purport to describe. That's too long. How can we even trust what they are saying there? We talked a little about memory yesterday, but really, 35 to 65 years, is that too long? Do we have any World War II vets in this room? Any World War II vets? Okay. How about Korean War vets? Okay. How about Vietnam War vets? Any? You guys don't like to fight, do you? Huh? Yeah. So, I'll do this in the U.S., and it's like, yeah, you'll get these veterans and say, do you still, Vietnam was 48 years ago we got out of Vietnam. Do you remember? Oh, yeah, I remember comment. Do they get all the details correct? Well, maybe not, but they have a really good idea of what that was like. Last night we saw Joe Galloway talk about it, right? About his experience in those 4 days of Vietnam, and yet that was 1965 that happened. So we can remember these big things. We may not remember all of the details correctly, but you know what? If you get a bunch of veterans together that were in the single battle, you can compare their accounts, and you'll have probably a majority of them, and you know, remember the same thing, and that can correct where someone went off a little bit, and you can pretty much get to what happened, though maybe not precise in all details. If 35 to 65 years is too long, then you need to call History Channel and all these different things to say, stop interviewing these people. I know they were eyewitnesses. I know that they were there, but it's too long after the events. We can't trust anything that they said. And of course, we're not going to do that. Eyewitness testimony is valuable, even 35 to 65 years, and even more after the events. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. Our two primary sources, we have other sources for Alexander the Great, but our two primary sources to know about him are Arian of Nicomedia, who wrote around the year 100, 425 years after he died, and then Plutarch, who writes around the year 110, about 435 years after Alexander died. Those are our two chief sources for Alexander the Great. Those are our two sources on which we rely the most to know about Alexander. So I think the Gospels, written at really 20 to 65 years later, that's not too bad, is it? Finally, eyewitnesses. You'll have some skeptics say, well, the Gospels aren't written by eyewitnesses, and they'll claim that because they say, well, number one, they're anonymous, right? And we see that really doesn't matter because we've got a lot of external sources that talk about the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there's really, it's unanimous for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and there's only one, perhaps two exceptions to John, and the one possible exception is unreliable, and the other one was written by a Gnostic, but other than that, it's all unanimous that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote those. But the eyewitness testimony, we saw about the authorship last night, where some of that comes from. Let's just review a little bit. So you got this guy named Papias who's writing somewhere between the years 100 and 135. And Papias, he says that he got his information from, well, it's a little bit vague, but he gets his information either from the Apostle John or a minor disciple who traveled with Jesus that is called the Elder John, or it could mean that he got it from an associate of the Apostle John or the Elder John. It's really difficult to know. We've got a guy named Irenaeus who's writing somewhere between the years 174 and 189, and he said that Papias knew the Apostle John and got his information from John. But then Eusebius takes issue with that. Eusebius is writing in the 320s, and he says Irenaeus was wrong, but Irenaeus was a lot earlier. Some scholars say we should trust Irenaeus, others say we should trust Eusebius. Who knows? I kind of lean toward Irenaeus because he's earlier. He'd been less than a century, probably about a half a century removed from Papias, and I think he's more likely to know the truth on it. But it's still a reliable source, and that information said that Mark wrote what he remembered Peter saying. That's pretty good source. Matthew is claimed to be the author of the Gospel of Matthew. Let me explain why that's a little bit fuzzy, okay? So you have Papias saying that Matthew wrote the oracles, the teachings, in the Hebrew dialect, and he's probably referring to Aramaic. So in other words, he's saying he wrote the gospel, or he wrote about the teachings of the oracles of Jesus in Aramaic. And then you have, I think, 7 church fathers who saying that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew. Okay, problem is that we don't have the gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. We only have it in Greek. There's only one manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. It's dated, I think, to the 14th century, and even critics will say this is a forgery. It's not what the early church fathers were talking about. So we don't have any manuscripts of the Gospel of Matthew in Hebrew. It's the only piece of New Testament literature that is said by some of the early church fathers to be written in Hebrew, everything else in Greek. Now, where's the problem? Everything we have of Matthew is in Greek, okay? And scholars who are specialists in the Greek language, now I've been studying Greek since 1983. And so I tried to read the New Testament in Greek as much as I can, the original language. Yet I'm not an expert in Greek. You'll take experts who really focus on the Greek, and even evangelicals, New Testament scholars whose expertise is the Greek, and they will say the Matthew that we have today is not written in translation Greek. In other words, they will say, these experts are saying, the Gospel of Matthew that we have today was originally written in Greek, the one that we have today. So what are we to make of the testimony of the early church fathers that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew? Because that would seem to be contradicted by what we have today. And then another thing we could point out is that there are really good reasons to believe Mark was the first gospel written and that Matthew used Mark as his primary source because of the verbal similarities, sometimes just dozens of words that are word for word in repeating it. So how do we explain that? Well, maybe Mark used Matthew, okay, you could say. But the problem with that is Papias says that Mark wrote down what he remembered Peter saying, not what Matthew had reported Peter had said. So if you're going to go with Matthew written in Hebrew, then, and you're saying that Mark used Matthew, well, then you go against Papias, who's our best and earliest source, because he's getting it from one of Jesus' disciples or an associate who went with it. So it's a little problematic. So what do we do there? Are these early church fathers wrong? I don't think so. Now, we can only speculate, but you can see where the problem comes in. And it's like, well, did Matthew actually write it? Did he write it in Hebrew? Do we have something that wasn't written by Matthew in our New Testaments today? So what I think probably happened, at least this is my speculation from now, everybody has some different views, and I could be wrong. In fact, I probably am wrong. I don't think anybody really knows. I've read books on this topic, and if there's like 5 scholars commenting on it, there's 7 opinions. We really just don't know. But if I had to take a wild guess, I would say Matthew originally wrote his gospel in Hebrew. And then Mark ended up writing his based on the testimony of Peter, and people liked that. And by the way, my guess is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't actually the ones writing. I think they used a secretary to write. And the reason being is because so many people, 90% of the people in antiquity, they couldn't read. 95% couldn't write either. So are we really to expect that John, a fisherman, is going to be able to write a gospel, a biography of Jesus, which is quite sophisticated in its philosophical discussions about the Logos in John? And what about Matthew? He's a tax collector. Yeah, he's probably somewhat literate, but being a tax collector doesn't require a great amount of literacy. And the Gospel of Matthew has a significant amount of artistic flavoring in it, which a lot of people don't recognize, but I mean, we could discuss it. But would a tax collector be so literate that they'd be able to write such an artistic rendition of Jesus' life? Probably not. So they probably used a secretary. Now, would that have been unusual? Not at all. Cicero was one of the most highly educated Romans, and he had a secretary named Tiro. And one time, the Roman general Pompey came over to visit and spend an evening with Cicero, and he asked Cicero to read something he had recently written. And at that point, Tiro was out of town recovering from an illness. And so Cicero tells Tiro in a letter, he says, when Pompey asked me to do this, I refused, saying that Tiro hadn't had a chance to look at it yet, and without him, I am altogether dumb. Paul, in 3 of his letters, he ends the letter by saying, I, Paul, write this greeting with my own hand. What does that signify? He didn't write the rest with it. You're saying, well, maybe he dictated it to it. Well, as my friend Randy Richards does with his students, he gives each of them a little piece of papyrus that on which they would have written, and he gives them a reed, and he gives them some ink, and he says, all right, I want you to write down what I dictate to you. Ready? Paul, an apostle. 1 minute later, of Jesus Christ. 1 minute later, by the will of God. Can you imagine trying to keep your thought in something like that? What probably happened, what we know of ancient writing techniques, is they had probably a kind of a board that would be hand carried. It would have wax on it, and then the secretary would take notes by writing those in the wax, which could be smoothed over and used again, writing these notes, and then the secretary would turn around and write the letter or whatever based on the notes, give it to the person to read. They'd read, they'd make comments about how to edit it, and then the secretary would go back and incorporate the edits, and they'd keep doing this until it was just right, and then they would send it in the person's name. So the person, you could say, Paul, was the actual author, but the secretary did a whole lot of editing and composition themselves. Proof of this? You say, well, that's just speculation. What's the crown jewel of all of Paul's letters? Romans. Who wrote Romans? Timothy? No? Chapter 16, verse 22. I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. Now, since Romans is written with a whole lot more sophistication and the literary quality is far superior to any other of Paul's letters, I think Tertius probably did a whole lot more than take Paul's dictation. Now, if Paul, who was highly educated, and Cicero, who were highly educated, would make use of secretaries, wouldn't we think that a tax collector and a fisherman would do the same? They wouldn't need to be literate. So they would have been like eyewitness testimony that were given this stuff. Now, here's what I think I'm going to speculate may have happened. And again, it's only speculation. I'm probably wrong. Nobody knows the answer, but here'd be my guess. Matthew writes his gospel first in Aramaic or Hebrew. Then Mark writes, based on the testimony of Peter. Matthew sees this, and he looks at his own work and says, oh man, I'm embarrassed for even trying to do this. The literary quality of this isn't good. And then so he gets a secretary and he says, okay, let's do this again. Let's do it in Greek this time, and use Mark as the primary source, and let me give you some information, maybe the cue, maybe those were his notes that he took. Let me give you some more eyewitness testimony from me, and you can weave it into the story as you're using Mark, and here's some other stories as well. And it's in Greek, and that's the Matthew we have today. That would make sense of all that the early church fathers said. It would still have Matthew as the author of it. And so that's just a guess, but you can see why the authorship of Matthew is kind of a fuzzy one. Luke received his information from eyewitnesses and those who knew him. And Mark received his information from Peter. So our eyewitness testimony, yeah, we've got that in the Gospels. They're carefully rooted in eyewitness testimony. So just to summarize here, gospel defense, talked about the A, B, C's, D's, and E's. Authorship, bias, contradictions, dating, and eyewitnesses. We can see that all 5 of these can be addressed adequately without really stretching things at all. There are very reasonable explanations for all these hesitations. And if you have any more questions, we're going to answer these here, but go to my website, risenjesus.com.